I'm known in the industry within the company as a subject matter expert. I have my own button on the Big Road Fleet Complete website, which I'm really proud of, and it's basically called Ask the Expert.
Yes, ask the expert. That was Marc Moncion from Fleet Complete, and he's my guest on this week's the Dawg on It Trucking Podcast. And Marc and I get talking about Canadian ELDs, when they might get implemented, the new U.S. hours of service rule changes that might or might not get implemented this year, and all the complexities of ELDs and hours of service. So join us. Let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Dawg on It Trucking Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Harris, Safety Dawg. And when it comes to trucking safety, the Dawg is on it. Please, if you would show your appreciation for the podcast by leaving a thumbs up, a comment, a rating, it would help me so much. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you. Now, let's get on with the show. Marc Moncion, welcome to the Dawg on It Trucking Podcast. How in the heck are you, my friend?
Doing very well, Chris. Nice to be on your call here. This is fantastic. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, not a problem. I think you've got a lot of great information that we need to share and get out to the public, especially about ELDs and hours of service and everything. But before we get into all that kind of stuff, can you give us a bit of a background on you? I first met you a long time ago when you were working for the MTO.
Exactly, yeah. Well, essentially, as you likely know, I literally eat, breathe, and sleep safety. It's in my DNA. I come from the trucking background. My dad was in the industry, and he's the one that got the diesel fumes and axle grease in my DNA. So I actually fully licensed CDL holder as well. But I come from a different background. So I have a law degree, and I also have a logistics designation from the CITT.
So, sorry, you're actually a lawyer?
Well, I have an honors BA in law. I didn't go off to law school. I ended up getting married and having kids instead. And then I went on to get a CITT designation, which I'm really proud of. The graduating year, I got the highest mark of the class, and I got this beautiful rhinoceros heirloom on my fireplace to it. And I sat on the board as well with CITT. So I've worked in the private and the public sector for about 30 years now.
Sorry, before you leave CITT, that's an acronym. Can you explain that for our viewers and listeners?
Sure. So that's the Canadian Institute of Traffic and Transportation. It's a multi-year program that it takes several years to complete. So I did that all online, and this is going back to my days with MTO. So when I was on the road away from my family in my hotel room, I was just taking online courses, and eventually finished it off, and I have CITT next to my name, and I'm proud to say that.
That's cool. What roles did you have when you were working for MTO?
I've had several roles since 1988. So when I first started, it was kind of interesting. I had just finished university, and my wife and I, over a cup of coffee, I was reading the Toronto Star, and they had the next generation of postings for enforcement officers throughout Ontario. And so there were several jobs across the province. And my wife and I were both from Timmins, Ontario, which is in the Great White North. So there was a posting in Timmins, and I said to my wife, I think I'm going to apply for this job. And this is going back to 1988. So it was a very long process in order to actually be hired. It was like 5 interviews. But anyway, I was selected, and I became a transportation enforcement officer, which was an on-road enforcement officer. The interesting thing about Northern Ontario compared to the South is in the North, you have to really be a generalist because there's not a lot of personnel. So you have to learn everything from weighing trucks to inspecting vehicles to dangerous goods to cargo security to opening and closing inspection stations to, I had to learn everything, which in hindsight was great because in the South, they earmark you for specialties based on what you're good at. So one would be the dangerous goods specialist. The other one would be the CVSA specialist. Another one would do investigations. Well, in the North, you had to do everything. So I did that for, 1988 until 1994, and then they created the facility audit program, in which was essentially you got a bigger stick. So you're going from on-road enforcement, talking to drivers, to off-road enforcement, where you're talking to company owners. And what was the interesting thing is when I would used to be on the road, the drivers would say, "My company is forcing me to do that, and I'm sorry, and I'm overloading, or I'm working too long, or my vehicle's not well maintained. It's the company's fault." Well, when you look at the flip side, I'm now interviewing the company owners, and they're saying it's the driver's fault. If those guys would only do proper pre-trips, do a better job at that. So, but it was just essentially carrying a bigger stick. And then in the late 90s, if you recall, wheels started flying off trucks. So there was a lot of incidents, and there was just one actually a few days ago. I don't know if you saw that on the news on the 401.
Yes, it was a horrific accident there.
Yeah, so when that happened, I had finished my law degree and I'd finished my CITD designation, and the director of the compliance branch back in the day invited me to work on a secondment, which was basically rewriting all of the truck safety violations, which I did. So I made a lot of new friends with these increased fines and all these new programs and policies, and eventually I was promoted to the Carrier Sanctions and Investigations Office. So that was in 1998. And then I moved on. I was an administrator, writing a lot of policies and programs, dealing with industry, getting to know stakeholders in the industry, meeting Chris Harris. I think that's when we first met.
Mm-hmm.
And then thereafter, I went into a team lead function with the ministry. And basically, I was leading the team, writing of the policies and programs. And I was doing a lot of speaking engagements. And there was one speaking engagement where I was talking about CVOR and other initiatives of the government, and the largest trucking insurance company CEO was in the audience, and after the speaking engagement came to see me and said, "We need to hire someone like you to work and head our safety programs with this insurance company," which I ended up doing. I did that for about 3 years, then the economy took a bit of a dive, and they ended up consolidating the company under like 4 companies under one umbrella. A lot of people ended up being outsourced from their roles. So I got into a little bit of consulting work. I wrote 3 books with the Canadian Trucking Alliance and l'Association du Camionnage du Québec. I wrote their Transportation of Dangerous Goods manual in English and French, and also Hours of Service. And thereafter, I ended up working for probably the largest waste management company in North America. I started with a role strictly in Ontario, and then I got promoted to all of Canada. And then I was promoted to all of North America. So I was their international director of safety for waste management. And then our company was acquired. And after the company was acquired, the same kind of thing with this insurance company where they ended up consolidating. There was 2 of me. One was an incumbent with the company. The other one was me. So we ended up parting ways, and it was around that same time where the largest 3PL in Canada reached out to me to be their head of safety, and that kind of worked out well because I was traveling a lot with this waste management company. Like I was gone 3 weeks a month. I was hardly ever home, and that was very difficult. Like I'm a very strong, family-oriented person. I was gone 3 weeks a month, and so this kind of the moons aligned with that. I ended up working pretty well strictly in Canada, but I had a team of about 50 people across Canada on the safety front. We did some recruiting up in Jamaica, some Jamaican drivers working of all places in northern Alberta, but that was kind of the mandate there. And I spent a bit of time up in Europe as well, recruiting some drivers in Europe. And, then ELD started emerging in the marketplace. And as you know, Chris, I'm very active in all social medias, and thereafter, the head of FleetComplete's human resources reached out to me and said, similarly to what had happened with the insurance company, we don't have anybody with your kind of background. Like we have a lot of superstars that do product development, research and development, but we don't have, and that's where I kind of fit in. So I started off with FleetComplete as the product owner, where I oversaw the hours of service product. And then as the company continued to grow and through acquisitions, we've now gone worldwide. We have offices worldwide. I evolved into the head of safety, compliance, and regulatory affairs. And We had the acquisition of Big Road, which I spent a lot of time with the Big Road folks. And we just kept on growing, and I took on a more corporate role. And eventually, like as of last year, I moved into an executive role, and I'm now the vice president of safety, compliance, and regulatory affairs. So I'm really proud of that. I'm known in the industry within the company as a subject matter expert. I have my own button on the Big Road FleetComplete website, which I'm really proud of, and it's basically called Ask the Expert. So I get asked questions from all different capacities all around the world in different languages, and there's a team that helps sort of cue these questions to me. And I respond back, whether you're a client or a non-client or a prospect. You know, if you want to know something about a truck, a bus, a truck driver, a bus driver, anything involving regulations, you know, you can reach out to me, and it's my pleasure to answer those types of questions. I have well over 100 blogs that I've written, both at FleetComplete and Big Road. It's on the Ask the Expert site, so you just have to click the button. I touch pretty well every department at FleetComplete and Big Road. I don't have staff actually working for me, but I interact with the salespeople, the tech support people, business development. I'm kind of like the acid test. Whenever the company is trying to put something new out into the marketplace, they'll push it out to me and say, like, you know, what do you think about this? Would this resonate with our customers or not? So I've helped reshape a lot of the programs, the product, to make it very, very user friendly. So I'm really become an advocate for a lot of our customers. I get a lot of calls. I'm on a lot of calls where customers have now deployed ELD. And I've come to find that there's a lot of misinformation, lack of knowledge in terms of hours of service. You know, so when people used to work in the paper world, but now under ELD, there's violations. They're unsure what these violations are, why they're happening. They don't know how to use this. Yeah, they don't know how to use the sleeper berth functions properly. The rules are different, as you know, Chris. Canada, United States are very complicated, east to west even. There's a lot of nuances, and it keeps Safety Dawg busy, and it keeps Marc Moncion busy as well. So yeah, I'm having a lot of fun. I got to tell you, it's like a second win. You know, I'm doing things that I really enjoy doing, so it's gone very well.
It's cool. I mean, obviously, with the advent of ELDs in the States, that created, I mean, there was always a need before that happened for electronic logging devices. But then when they mandated it, of course, there was a lot of holdouts that all of a sudden companies like FleetComplete got a lot more customers.
Yep. I go back to the day, if you recall, where we were getting close to the milestone date in the United States, and people were always of the mindset that at the 11th hour, they would just rescind the rule. Well, you should have seen the mad dash at the 11th hour. Like, we had people, you know, all hands on deck at FleetComplete, people working 24/7, people being pulled from other capacities to answer questions, to help with the onboarding.
Yeah.
I was flooded with stuff, but, you know, it all worked out really well. And now in Canada, there's not going to be the grandfathering clause, and no.
I was going to say we're going to do the same stuff here in Canada, just about.
Yeah, so it's going to be a little bit different, though, I think, in Canada, because for the better part, as you know, a lot of the movement of goods is north-south. So a lot of the larger carriers are already ELD compliant with the United States. Where the catch is going to be, and as you know, it's the third-party certification process, of which I'm on the stakeholder committee with Transport Canada and the Canadian Council of Motor Transport Administrators. The self-certification is going to be quite different, and you're going to see a lot of US-based motor carriers that are using non-compliant ELDs wanting to come into Canada. These guys are gonna just like, sorry, we're not certified by Transport Canada. We can't service you in Canada. So that's going to create an issue, I think. The other thing is
for the American carriers.
Yes, yeah. That and the other thing, and the other thing I think is probably going to happen is, as I alluded to earlier, the rules are different, Canada and US. There's a lot of nuances. Like in Canada, our rules for the better part are much more flexible than the United States. The exception is the personal conveyance requirements, as you know. Yeah. So you're going to have motor carriers in the United States using personal conveyance, And as soon as they cross the border into Canada and they're pulling a trailer or they're carrying a load, they're going to say to the officer at the scale, I'm using personal conveyance, and the officer is going to say, well, sorry, you can't use personal conveyance in that fashion in Canada.
Yeah,
So that's
I've
going to be
done.
that's
I
going to be
think
problematic.
I think there's 3 videos I've completed about one about the personal conveyance rule in the States, and then 2 more about how Canadians are getting tickets because they're legally using personal conveyance in the States, but when they
Yep,
cross the border, as you say, they're not legal now.
exactly.
So
That's problematic. And as a former regulator, I always wish governments would get on the same page. It's easy for me to say that now that I'm in private industry. I couldn't say that when I was with the ministry. But even within the provinces, you don't have agreements. You know, like Western Canada doesn't want the cycles, and the East, they want more flexibility. It's just all over the place. Now you're adding the United States to the mix. It's just it creates so much complexity. Like even within the company I work for, I'm constantly educating staff about, these new rules and how it's going to affect them, and how the rules engine has to be tweaked Canada and the United States. So that's been very interesting for me.
well, in the whole process now, um, I really wonder, as you had already said, there's a lot of carriers who have ELDs.
Yep.
Most of these ELD systems come from the US, and not all of them are large competitors of Fleet Complete. There are some really small people.
Yep.
And I really question whether some of those smaller companies even know that there is a mandate to get themselves certified to be legal in Canada. And I
Yeah,
think,
that's going to be a real challenge if you're not on par. Like you take, for example, in the United States under the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration website, the list of certified ELD vendors. If you've ever gone on that site,
oh yeah,
you can see, like ours as an example. Everyone is obliged to post their user manual. Well, you got some user manuals there that are like 10 pages long. The rule making is like over 500 pages. Like, don't tell me you've done all of the functional requirements within the rules engine with a 10-page user guide. So that's gonna be pretty interesting, I think, as we move forward. So looking
well,
forward looking forward to that. I'll be very busy again with this next phase in Canada.
well, when I understand that they've opened up, or they put out the request for ELD providers to submit their devices now so
Yep.
that they can be certified here in Canada. Is that true?
Yeah, so they're working through. There's a process that it hasn't been. I would have hoped like a little more engaging. You compare it to the United States, we get flooded with information. In Canada, like they don't have the team that they have in the United States. They have a much smaller group of people. But they've done things such as putting. Have you seen their FAQ on the Transport Canada's website? They have an
No?
FAQ that, yeah, you should maybe go on there.
Well,
It's
if you send me the link, and I'll put it in the show notes so that the
yeah,
viewers can
yeah.
go on it.
Yeah, so it's Transport Canada. They created an ELD, what you need to know web link, and on it it's
Okay.
got the Canadian ELD standards. It's got the FAQs. There's an info bite on there as well, and they've engaged vendors and myself on behalf of Fleet Complete Big Road. I've sent them a whole list of comments and questions because, again, the functional requirements in the United States are different than the functional requirements in
Oh
Canada.
yeah.
I was hoping they'd be the same, but they're not. Just there's the Canadian flavor of the day part of it. So it's keeping me gainfully employed. I can tell you that it's keeping me busy. But yeah, there are some changes that people will have to be aware of.
So in Canada, I mean, one of the big differences between Canada and the US rule is that ELDs have to be certified so that we don't get
Exactly.
into the mess
Yep.
that I read an article in the States that they figure somewhere between 25 and 50% of the um, ELDs that are on the FMCSA website actually don't meet the standard.
Exactly. Yeah, you're correct. You're correct. That's
Which,
probably it. Maybe even be higher. I don't know. But what's happening is ELD vendors are become decertified, either voluntarily, or what's typically happening is when the trucker gets stopped at roadside, the officer asks for the ELD output file to be displayed, and it's very prescribed what the output file must look like. It's much different than your standard log. And if it doesn't have these additional parameters, it actually flags the officer at roadside that this is a non-compliant device. The other is when they do the ELD data transfer with the EROD system. If it doesn't transmit correctly according to the parameters of the DOT, that's another flag that would then get escalated to FMCSA, and that would trigger the decertification process. And the other thing is the ELD information packet that has to be surrendered, the driver card. Now in Canada, it's going to be different because we're not following the EROD data transfer. It's just going to be.
I mean, the Canadian devices have to do the EROD data transfer. And for the listeners, what we're talking about is how does your roadside enforcement officer get your information from the electronic logging device? That transfer system is what we're talking about.
Yep.
And so there's a certain protocol that all the ELDs do now, but in Canada, you just said we're not going to follow the same thing?
We're not, no, there's not going to be any EROD data transfer process. It's basically the driver is going to be asked to PDF the actual logs, either the log for the day in question or the log in the previous 14, which in Canada is 14, whereas in the United States it's 7. And it's simply going to be Chris Harris at mpo.gov.on.ca. Just email that PDF to me. So it doesn't go to like a third-party repository and gets bounced back to the officer at the roadside or the scale. So it's different.
I mean, that sounds really good, except for if I was running Northern Ontario, where we know, and I mean, Canada just doesn't have the cell phone network that other countries may have. There's a lot of areas that aren't covered yet.
Exactly. How that's going to be captured, Chris, is basically in regulation. The officer is going to say, okay, do we have coverage for you to email me via the PDF? If the cell service isn't there, then the regulation says you must now be in a position to display it to me. So display it on the tablet or on the phone. And where another thing that's getting challenging is the third option being printing. Not every trucker has a printer in their truck. So what is also challenging is officers are not going to go into the cab of the truck. So there is some technology where the device is actually hardwired, tethered to the truck. So then the driver is saying, well, Mr. Officer, just come up on my running boards and I'm going to show you my device. Well, the officer, some will get on the running boards. Some are going to say, no, you have to actually physically give it to me. And there are some drivers and companies being charged in the United States for that very thing if they cannot physically give the device to the officer. Now, the other thing that's kind of interesting, something talking about features with our product to make it user-friendly. When I was working with Big Road, I said, you know what we got to do? We got to lock in like the actual inspection mode. Lock that in, because not that officers are going to start purposely going through someone's personal records, but if you don't lock it in and just show the logs that they're requesting, an officer could inadvertently start looking at other things, right? So so I've got this system where the driver will lock into inspection mode and all the officer can see are the logs for the day in question, and also if they want to review their DVIR, their driver vehicle inspection report, we have that capability as well. But the officer cannot go on a tangent and start looking at family pictures and looking at other things, and etc. So that's just another user-friendly thing I tried to do for the truckers with FleetComplete and Big Road.
Yeah, no, I mean, privacy, we all know privacy is hugely important. And, we're still in the midst of COVID when they're talking about tracking devices for people who are infected or became infected. And, privacy, I'm not sure where all that's going to go. And I'm not sure that truck drivers understand how much information big data has on everybody.
Right.
Now, a lot of it is there's no name associated with it, but there's an awful lot of information.
There certainly is. Even with this COVID, like at FleetComplete, our business is really, really boosted up because we do a lot of work with first responders, police, enforcement, ambulance, and they want to know where their assets are at all times. There's a lot of incidents, as you know, in the United States of violence against truckers, and having the ability to know in real time where an actual vehicle is located, and telling where drivers should reroute using our fleet tracking software to reroute around all these dispute areas. So
Now, is
we,
that dynamic?
yeah, yeah,
Is it?
yeah.
That's
So
cool. And
yeah,
again, just for our listeners, when I ask the word dynamic, um, what happens is, and Mark, correct me because this is my understanding of it. And as you know, I'm not in a truck and I don't work for an ELD provider, but
yeah,
to me, dynamic means that the truck is on a certain route. And if a
exactly.
highway was to get closed, then the driver gets a notice and is told to reroute according to the closure, um, saving money and a lot of time for the truck driver. Is that basically what dynamic means?
Essentially, yeah, real time, like real time live notices to say, there's actually a dispute at this bridge here in San Francisco. I think you'd best take the secondary route, so reroute yourself in that fashion.
And
And
and FleetComplete knows the truck routes, right?
oh yes, absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely, absolutely.
Well,
We
you
try
know
to.
our experience in the insurance business, how many bridges we tried to
Oh,
deliver with
yeah, I know. I still see the pictures of the bridges on Facebook and so on. Support truckers. The sign's right there.
yeah,
It's not 13 feet 6 here. Don't go here.
yeah. Well, that's what, with this, it's more complexity when you're trying to do dynamic routing.
Yeah,
Um, Obviously, I mean, it's obvious to me, and I just wanted you to say it, that FleetComplete knows the truck route,
yeah,
and wouldn't send the driver off on some inappropriate area. But,
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
you know,
exactly.
talking about the Canadian rules or the ELDs, any idea when they might come into effect? What have you
Uh,
heard? I know, you know, it was June 2021 is the last date I actually heard.
Yeah, June 13th, 2021, there's not going to be a grandfathering provision. The decision was made to not do that, unlike what happened in the United States, where they had the phased-in approach with automatic onboard recording devices
Right?
to then full ELD. For those that didn't have ELD, well, in Canada, it's just going to be full ELD. Now, the other thing that's really key, and for your listeners, is this is a federal law. This is Transport
Yep.
Canada federal law. So a lot of carriers that go north-south will likely still have an ELD, which will then have to be compliant with the Canadian requirements. These same motor carriers that travel east-west would likely still deploy ELD. Now, some fleets, and you know this as well, some fleets have a mixed fleet. They say some are ELD, some are paper logs.
Yeah.
Like as a former safety director, that's very complicated to try and manage a mixed fleet. One day the driver's on paper logs, the next day he's on electronic logs, and he's got to account for his previous 14 days. So a lot of carriers have just said, let's just go full ELD, east-west. Where the challenge is going to be are the intra-provincial carriers. So basically the carriers that stay within the domicile of a province. So say Ontario, unless the government of Ontario elects not to adopt the rule, then these carriers will technically be exempt. Now,
Right.
I'm anticipating provinces like Ontario's already made the statement through the minister that we will comply with the rules. Same thing with some provinces out in Western Canada. Some have remained silent, but I'm anticipating hopefully full compliance, because it's going to be confusing for those carriers that are sometimes in ELD, sometimes not in ELD. So that'll be interesting to see.
Well, just to be clear though, this is a federal law, so anybody that goes outside of their base province
Yes,
will have to comply, and that's June the
exactly.
13th, you said 2021?
June 13th, 2021. Now, the other thing, and I haven't heard this yet, and you know yourself, like some provinces have different requirements for hours of service than others. So
Yeah.
again, like you take in some provinces, the elapsed 16-hour rule applies, in others it does not. In some provinces, the cycle rules don't apply. In some provinces, the single and the team drivers are somewhat different. The emergency and adverse road condition. North of 60, you have different requirements there. So it should be fun.
Yeah, that's the one word for it. It should be fun. Well, and the biggest thing is, I wonder how, what carriers or what ELD providers who are currently servicing Canadian companies are not going to bother getting certified, because I imagine two points to that. One, it costs money, and some
Yep.
of them may not have enough business structure here in Canada to justify the outlay.
Yep.
And the second part is because they have to comply, and our rules are more flexible, which I think equals complexity. Uh,
Absolutely.
the
Absolutely.
programmers are going to go crazy trying to make their device comply.
Yep. So
So there's
you
going to be a
have
lot of money in it.
there's a lot of development work, and the team at Big Road have been working diligently with me as well. I'm providing all of the rules, engine nuances to them. Like, I'm not a developer.
Right.
So when I talk to the team, I say, I don't know how to code this, but I'm telling you, if you're going to go north of 60, the hours in a day are different. You know, the off-duty times, the splits are all different. So I provide them with all the regulatory nuances, but then they go ahead and develop the programs. And we have regular meetings, update meetings, where they advise how they're coming along. But I fully anticipate FleetComplete to be 100% compliant. We've actually even got an official letter that's been written by our executive vice president, honoring the fact that, you know, at FleetComplete Big Road, we are going to be fully compliant, not only U.S. side, but Canada side and provincially as well.
Yeah, that's great, because I'm not aware of many other Canadian ELD providers.
There's a couple of them. There's a couple. We're one of the largest, if not the largest, ELD
Yeah,
vendor.
I mean, I did some work with, and I'll mention them, Fleet Rover.
Hmm.
You won't, but I will. But I mean, I know that you have Fleet Complete also has an association. I don't know what. I haven't heard from Fleet Rover in a long, long time. We don't even know if they're still operating at the moment. But they were Canadian as well, out of the high tech area of Waterloo.
Right. Yeah, you're correct. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, anything else you want to say about the Canadian rules? And so we got the date. We got it's going to cost money. It's very complex. What else is happening here in Canada for ELDs, or even are there any hours of service changes coming? Any
There
rule
aren't
changes?
there aren't any contemplated, but I'm hoping, you know, the government of Canada takes this opportunity to perhaps revisit some of the requirements. You know, I sit on the committee. They haven't actually pushed that out to the stakeholder group, but if they do, I'm certainly going to make comment on areas where I think it would modernize the requirements. They certainly, our rules are much more flexible than the United States
Yeah.
already, so I wouldn't want to make them even more flexible. But things such as, you know, in Canada we have a specific definition of a day. Like, that's very complicated.
Right.
So, you know, so for a fleet that has 50 drivers, they can all have different definitions of a day, and they keep that definition throughout their cycle until it resets. And it
Right.
makes it also very complicated for the enforcement community. As a former government auditor, I would go in and audit carriers. If I had a carrier that had like 8 different definitions of a day, it made my job complicated. But, you know, that's one thing. I already alluded to the personal conveyance requirements. I find they're pretty restrictive. I think that would be an opportunity to, I wouldn't go full bore like the United States, because it's very difficult to enforce based on the language.
Yeah, they've opened that up to a lot of
Oh
fraud, I
yeah.
think.
Oh yeah, it's very, very difficult to enforce that personal conveyance requirements now. There's a whole detailed document, I'm sure you've looked at it, where you can qualify for the personal conveyance. The other big difference between the two countries is, in the United States, you have a number of lobby groups, stakeholder interest groups,
Oh,
and you can't please everybody. Like, I think you've heard about the last hours of service reforms that have been proclaimed. I'm not sure if it's going to happen by September 30th, 2020. That's the push. But you have, you know, the American Trucking Association, the Truckload Carriers Association pushing in favor of the law. You've got the Teamsters against the law. You've got there's an organization that represents the rail industry. Forget
gosh.
the Yeah, Crash. They're pushing against it. You have truck drivers that are saying it hasn't gone far enough.
Yeah.
You don't see that kind of, like, in Canada, we got the Canadian Trucking Alliance, we got OTA and all the provincial associations, and they're all in favor of ELD, but you don't really hear a lot on the flip side of things. So
No, and sorry about the U.S. law, and I was going to ask you what you thought of it, but I really don't believe we're going to see that change come this year. Because
yeah, I've heard a lot of rumblings because of that. There's a new regulation coming place with the U.S. DOT. It's through their FAST Act,
yeah,
2015 FAST Act, and I'm thinking it could delay it. So take an ELD vendor such as ours, like Big Road. I put a whole detailed chart together, the current and the new, and how it differentiates from one another. So we have to plan that it's going to happen. So the development work has to actually get done.
right.
But it's just like, if they don't move with the regulation, it's wasted time and money for my company, right? Because the developers are working on certain things. They could be working on something else for the company. Now we've got to amend our rules engine to account for a reg change in the United States, which may or may not happen. So we got to err on the side of caution, and I've directed them to, update the rules engine to accommodate these changes, under the hope that if it does get changed, at least we're going to have the work done and not have to do like a mad scramble at the 11th hour.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. And of course, you've only got so many resources. And right now, I imagine you've got a lot of resources working to get everything compliant with the Canadian stuff.
Exactly.
And then all of a sudden you've got all this not a little side job,
Yep.
but you've got another job to make it compliant with a possible new U.S. rule that may or may not take effect on September, I think it was 28th is what I had heard. But,
Yep.
Because they tied it to a bill.
They did tie it to a bill. Yep.
That's going to delay it.
Yep.
So
you also have that group, the Owner Operator Independent Drivers Association.
Yeah, OIDA.
Yeah, they're dead set against it as well. They think it hasn't gone far enough, type thing, or just get rid of. Let's not have any hours of service rules altogether. But each stakeholder group has legitimate concerns, and it's just trying to please everybody is just not going to happen, really.
Yeah. Well, I'm of the belief that if we just all drove when we were wide awake and not fatigued or anything, we wouldn't have needed the hours of service.
I know.
Because we allow people to push us, or for many reasons. We sometimes choose to not do the right things as humans. Yep. And
everyone gets painted with the same brush, and that's the unfortunate thing, But that's how regulations work. It tends to be very reactionary. It's like the wheel-off legislation. People are being hurt, so let's throw a $50,000 fine at you through absolute liability. And now how about the enforcement side of it? Like, you can have all the rules in the world, but if it's not going to be enforced, then that's another problem in itself, right?
Yeah. Just before we wrap up, Mark, what else do we want to cover?
Well, I'm pretty good with what we talked about, unless you want to go into more detail about the U.S. rules, but that may be a little premature now. We could perhaps follow up if we know there's a concrete
when there's a date.
Yeah, then if you wish to have me on, we can have a discussion just about the rules on that front, and it'd be my pleasure to join you for that.
Yeah, I think that would be super, actually, because because so many of our drivers do cross the border. They need to understand the rules.
Yep.
And the last company I was working with intimately, I found out again how the drivers really don't understand the rules. The ELD says, you're in violation, and they go, why?
Yep, exactly. Well, I'm here to help, and again, I post a lot of material on Ask the Expert. If ever you're looking, or your audience is looking for anything, you go to Big Road's homepage, FleetComplete's homepage. I have my own little button called Ask the Expert. You just click on that, and likely, if you're curious about something, I likely have written about it already.
Well, we'll put a link in the show notes to the Ask the Expert. I don't know why I'm tripping over that. Ask the Expert shouldn't be that difficult. But we'll put a link in the show notes right to it. Your contact info is in the show notes, of course.
Yep.
And Mark, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. A great interview. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Always a pleasure chatting with you, Chris. Have a great day, and congratulations on the podcast as well.
Hey, thank you.
Have a great day.
I hope you loved the show as much as I did. please leave us a like, a thumbs up, a review, a comment, a rating if it is in your heart. Thank you so much. And I do really appreciate your time. And join us again next week for another exciting interview.